Hello fellow geeks and welcome back to Running Geek Girl. My name is Heather, the Running Geek Girl, and I'm glad you're here today because this video is going to be just a little different. You'll notice I'm sitting in the comfy chair. We have very comfy furniture here in the Geek Den, but somebody brought to my attention a particular marathon that happened many years ago, and the story was just so crazy I thought there's no way this is real. But I looked it up, I did some research, and it is very real. This is probably one of the craziest running stories that I've heard lately, and I thought I absolutely had to share it with you. So let's go back all the way to 1904, where the Olympic Games were taking place in St. Louis, Missouri. At that time, the Olympics were going on at the same time as the World's Fair, which was happening in St. Louis to celebrate the anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, if you're not familiar with Olympic marathoning, it's actually a really big deal now. It's usually one of the last events that occurs before the closing of the ceremonies. Everything kind of builds up to the marathon. In 1904, though, this was a little bit different. For example, back then, a lot of the events that we have now did not exist, and they did not really let female competitors take place. Also, the Russo-Japanese War was taking place, and that restricted travel from a whole lot of other countries. Now, just to give you an idea of how restricted this was, in the 2016 Games, there were over 11,000 Olympic athletes. In 1904, there were 62 international athletes. Yes, 62 athletes who were able to travel to America to participate. Also, it was originally supposed to happen in Chicago, but because the World's Fair was happening in St. Louis kind of threw a fit and managed to get the Olympic Games moved from Chicago to the World's Fair site in St. Louis so that both would happen at the same time. So it was kind of crazy. Another big difference that was happening at this particular Olympics was this was the first time that gold medals were going to be given out. Now, before that point, if you won, you were given a silver medal. If you came in second place, you got a bronze medal. And if you came in third place, they sent you home. Thanks, try again next time. So this was the first time that they were going to be honoring the top three on the pedestal, and they were going to actually offer a gold medal for first place in each event. So let's talk a little bit about how this particular marathon was set up for these Olympic Games. First of all, look at the athletes themselves. Now, some of the runners were marathoners who had excelled in their field. They had run the Boston Marathon. They had placed before running an Olympic marathon. But the majority of the field were middle distance runners or people who were considered oddities. And now you had some Americans. So there was Sam Mellor, A.L. Newton, John Lorden, Michael Spring, Thomas Hicks. They were all experienced marathoners, and they were the favorites in the field. There was another American, Fred Lortz. He did all of his training at night because he worked all day as a bricklayer, and nighttime was the only time that he had to practice running. He was able to get his spot in the Olympics by winning a special 5-mile race that was put on by the Amateur Athletic Union. But then amongst the international runners, you had 10 people from Greece who had never run a marathon before. There were 2 men from South Africa who were part of the South African World's Fair exhibit, and they arrived at the starting line barefoot, not really knowing how long they were going to have to run. There was Felix Carbajal from Cuba. He was a former mailman, and he raised money to come to the United States by running in different races around Cuba. One time he ran from one end of the island to the other. So he was able to raise money. He got as far as New Orleans and lost all of his money gambling, as you do. So he had to do a mixture of walking and hitchhiking to get the rest of the way to St. Louis. That's not a short trip for those of you who are not in the U.S. So he shows up at the starting line wearing a white long sleeve shirt, dark long pants, a beret, and a pair of street shoes. And one of his competitors took pity on him and offered to get some scissors to cut his pants off at the knee so he could at least be a little bit cooler while he was running. And yes, it was very warm because for some reason, the organizers of the race thought that they would start the race in the middle of the afternoon instead of in the morning. And that meant that they were running in temperatures around 86 to 89 degrees Fahrenheit. That'd be over 30 degrees Celsius. The track itself was made up of dirt roads going around St. Louis. that were not closed to the public. So these are dirt roads with cars and horses on them, kicking up dust as they go past the competitors. This was a huge problem, as you can imagine. At one point, people found American runner William Garcia lying on the road in the middle of the track. He had breathed in so much dust that it caused an erosion of the membranes in his stomach, which caused a serious hemorrhage and almost killed him. There was one water stop on the entire course. It was a well at mile 11, and a lot of the foreign runners that were visiting were not accustomed to the water that they had here in that well, and it caused a whole slew of intestinal problems as they were trying to finish. Now, American runner Fred Lortz didn't even make it to the well. He collapsed from dehydration at mile 9. He comes up with this brilliant idea of just hitching a ride, because there's horses and cars that are going down the road past them as they're trying to run this marathon. So he says, I'm dehydrated, I don't feel good, I'm just going to hitch a ride to the finish line and meet up with everybody there. So he manages to hitch a ride. He's leaning out the window, waving at the crowd as he goes past, so they know he is riding all the way to the finish line. Unfortunately, the car breaks down at mile 19, so he jumps out of the car and decides he's going to run the last 5 miles of the race. And surprise, surprise, he's the first one to the finish line. They assume he's the winner, and he decides he's going to play along with it. He even got as far as having his picture taken with Alice Roosevelt, and he was seconds away from being given the gold medal before a spectator stepped up and said, that's the guy that took a car to the finish line? So Lortz throws out the whole, oh, I was just kidding, I wasn't really going to accept a gold medal. The organizers were not going to have any of that, and they ended up banning him from competition for the next year. They originally were going to ban him for life. However, I believe that they changed it to a year because he did end up competing later. Going back to our Cuban runner, Felix Carbajal, he had not eaten for 40 hours before the marathon started. So when the marathon path took him past an apple orchard, he decided to veer off and eat some apples. Some of those apples turned out to be rotten, and they gave him horrible stomach cramps. He rests in the orchard for a while and then decides he's going to pick up and start running again. And he stood a real shot of being able to win that marathon, but instead decided he was going to stop and talk to people in the crowd for a while, catch his breath, rest up, and then run a little farther. Despite all of this, he ends up 4th place in the marathon. Our 2 runners from South Africa, who, by the way, were the first black runners to participate in the Olympic marathon as far as we know, they were expected to finish in record time, but it just didn't happen. There was one that ended up in 9th place, and the other was chased off the course by angry dogs. By the time he was able to get back onto the course, he finished in 12th place. All this pales in comparison to what happened with American competitor Thomas Hicks. He was born in Britain, moved to America, and competed in the marathon for America. He was 10 miles into the race, so almost to that one water stop, when he started showing signs of extreme exhaustion. He had a 2-man support team, so even though he's begging for a drink, they just ended up sponging out his mouth with a little bit of distilled water and sent him on his way. 7 miles before the finish line, he is so exhausted he just wants to lie down and quit. But his handlers are telling him no, he has to keep going. Instead, they give him what is considered to be a good medicine at the time. And remember that these are the days before performance-enhancing drugs were considered a thing. But they decided to give him one called sulfate of strychnine. It's also known as rat poison. In a high enough dose, of course, that's going to kill him. But back in that day, people used it as a stimulant. And at the time, remember, there's no rules against performance-enhancing drugs, so they gave it to him. So now, not only is he dehydrated, but he has more or less strychnine in his blood. His handlers tell him that Lortz has been disqualified for taking a car to the finish line, so he decides he's gonna give it a shot. So he starts trying to run, but his trainers are thinking that he's not going to make it. So they decide to give him a second dose of strychnine with egg whites. And this time, they also gave him some brandy to wash it down, because why not? According to a historian at the time, he said that he was running mechanically Like a well-oiled piece of machinery, his eyes were dull, lusterless, the ashen color of his face and skin had deepened, his arms appeared as weights well tied down, he could scarcely lift his legs, and his knees were almost stiff. So he's almost at the finish line, and he starts hallucinating that the finish line is actually another 20 miles away. During the last mile, he starts begging for something to eat. Then he starts begging to let him lie down. So they give him more brandy and 2 more egg whites. There were 2 last hills that he had to get up before the finish line. He managed to jog up the hills and walk down. When he entered the stadium where the finish line was, he tried to run. He couldn't do it. He could pretty much just shuffle along. So his trainers come and pick him up and carry him over the finish line, moving his legs back and forth for him so it would look like he was running. And at that point, they just went ahead and declared that he was the winner. It took 4 doctors an hour working on Hicks to make him well enough to be able to even leave the stadium. The man lost 8 pounds over the course of the race. So the next year, they decide to lift the ban on Lortz. They allow him to run in the Boston Marathon, and he runs against Hicks the next year and beats him. Lortz finishes the Boston Marathon in 2:38:25 and did not have to actually hitch a ride to the finish line this time around. So there you go. That is the story of probably the craziest Olympic marathon that will ever happen. It was just something that I kind of dove into because I thought there's no way this story is real, and I kept finding more and more sources, and it's real and it's crazy, and we've come a long way since then. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this. If you did, go ahead and give me a thumbs up or leave a comment down below. You can also follow me on social media. You can find me across most platforms under the name Running Geek Girl. I hope you enjoyed this story. I'm glad that you could be here for it, and I'll see you next time. Happy running. Now, ooh, hello camera.